For this project, I've been commissioned to make a 10-inch Gyuto knife for a friend of mine who also just happens to be a private chef. While I'm making a profile of the blade here, some of the things that we discussed prior to me making this were length, weight, thickness, and type of steel. The type of steel being used is 1095. It's an affordable steel that holds a great edge and is very easy to sharpen, which are two things that are very important to the client. As for the weight, the client wanted this Gyuto to be on the heavier side, closer to a pound. To achieve this weight, the steel thickness I ended up choosing was 3/16 inch. In my opinion, this was the correct thickness to choose, as it would help get the weight as close to a pound as possible, but also not affect the performance. Typically, Gyutos are fairly thin and weigh less than half a pound. I think if I would have went thicker than 3/16 inch, maybe to a 1/4 inch, it probably would have affected the performance of the knife in a negative way. The steel that I ordered was from Maritime Knife Supply. I'm a big fan of Dennis Tyrell, and I know they sponsor him. It says that the steel comes annealed. However, I noticed that when doing the rough profile with the angle grinder, it took a while, and so I wanted to test the hardness. Using these files, I went through 50 HRC all the way up to 65, and noticed that these were not annealed at all, and they were extremely hard. So what I wanted to do first was put it in the forge and let it anneal. That way it's much easier to work with. After taking the annealed piece of steel out of the forge, I used a 50 HRC file to test the hardness. When the piece you're working on has scale on it and you're trying to do a file test, it can be a little tricky because you don't really know whether or not it's biting into the scale or biting into the steel underneath. However, I got through the scale and did notice that the 50 HRC file was biting into the steel. Using a 60 grit ceramic belt, I begin the process of rough shaping the knife. If you've seen my videos in the past, you can tell that I got a new belt grinder. After my old Craftsman bit the dust, I ended up spending a little more money than I wanted to get something a little nicer. The reviews on this product weren't the best, but since then, Grizzly has made changes to the motor to help it last longer and perform better. Unfortunately, when I got to start working on the bevels, the motor did heat up. I don't know what exactly caused it, if it was me applying too much pressure, if it was me moving my machine outside being in direct sunlight, but basically the motor came up with an error and would not work anymore. The good news is I contacted Grizzly and it was under the 1-year warranty, and they shipped a brand new motor for me, and it came to my house within 3 weeks of me calling. So if any knife maker hobbyists can't quite yet afford a 2x72 and are looking for the next best thing, I would highly recommend the Grizzly 2x42. All I have to say is take your time, don't rush your projects, and it should turn out just fine. I want the primary bevels to be halfway up the depth of the knife. With the depth being 2 inches, I set my calipers to 1 inch and scribed the line. Because there's no forging involved and this knife project is simply stock removal, I used a ball peen hammer to create dimples in the top parts of the knife in order to give it some texture. Before I take the knife over to the belt grinder to start putting the primary bevels in, I use a Sharpie and a caliper to mark the center line of the knife. One of the best things about making this style of knife compared to a typical hunting knife or camp knife is that there's no plunge lines. Most knife makers can agree that matching the plunge lines on a knife is one of the hardest things to do in knife making. And for those of you watching or listening that don't know what a plunge line is, it's the part of the knife where the sharp edge transitions into the, tang or ricasso. For heat treatment, I brought the entire blade up to a bright red, almost reddish orange color, held it there and soaked it at that color for 10 minutes, quenched in Parks 50, and then tempered for 2.5 hours at 400 degrees. After I went as far as I could on the belt grinder, I hand sanded all the way up to 600 grit. To get to 600 grit, I went from 120, 220, 320, 400, and then 600. And the reason why I stopped at 600 was because it seemed to have a nice satin finish, which is what my customer wanted. The handle on a Japanese style kitchen knife is called a wall handle. To make the wall handle for this knife, I started with a piece of walnut and cut it into a long section that was approximately 1 1/8 inch by 1 1/8 inch. The client wanted this handle to be somewhere between 5 and 5.5 inches. When making a slot to insert the tang, I use a drill bit size just slightly smaller than the thickness of the blade. On the side that isn't exposed, I use a drill bit that's the size of the tang to put a large hole. This large hole serves a purpose of allowing the tang to fit in nicely, yet snug, and also allows more room for epoxy. Using small files, I start to refine the tang slot. Sandwiched between the two pieces of walnut, I'm going to use black G10 spacers as well as copper spacers. I decided not to put it in the video, but I used JB Clear Weld to bond all the layers together. Before assembling the handle, I cover up any areas on the knife that have the potential of getting epoxy on them. Using GB clear weld, I carefully assemble each piece of the handle and then clamp together for a tight fit. To get the desired octagonal shape of the wall handle, I start with the belt grinder and then move my way over to the files for the more detailed work. Once I have the desired shape, I begin hand sanding up to 600 grit. The client requested that I do a burnt finish on the walnut handle. At first, I was a little hesitant to agree to such a task just because I've never done it before and I wasn't really sure on how it would affect the outcome. I mean, I've never seen that before on a handle and I didn't know if it would look good or bad, and I would hate to do this whole handle and then ruin it at the end. Luckily for me though, I think it turned out really well and I'll probably incorporate it on more knives in the future. To finish the handle, I'm going to use a combination of food grade mineral oil and beeswax. I didn't include it in this video, but I also made a saya for this, which is a wooden scabbard to store the knife in. It's made with walnut and has the same burnt finish, and I also use the same mixture of beeswax and mineral oil. I also use the same mixture to coat the blade before I give it to the customer. The very last step when making a knife is to give it an edge, or as we like to call it, a secondary bevel. Normally I'll take all my knives up to 1500 grit, but because this is a chef knife and needs to be the absolute sharpest it can possibly be, I took it up to 3000. After all the sharpening's done, I always test every knife I make on a piece of paper. If it can't cut paper, then it's not sharp. And there you have it, guys. We're done with the knife. If you guys like this video, feel free to comment, share, subscribe, like. Any type of support always helps and I'm always grateful. If you're interested in how I made the saya sheath, drop a comment below and I might do a tutorial on one. Either way, I'll see you guys in the next video. God bless.